I'm Ralph McInerney, a professor of philosophy at the University of Notre Dame, where I've taught since 1955, a long time ago. And I'm going to give a course, a short course, on the topic faith and reason. There's been much confusion about what Catholic doctrine is. I'm going to be relying on an encyclical of John Paul II of some 10 years ago now, I guess, called Faith and Reason, Faith and Reason. And in that encyclical, the Pope addresses the time-honored, centuries-old, from the earliest days of the Church, attitude that the Church has towards human reason. Now, we, of course, are living in the third millennium, and you will know the opening of Charles Dickens' Tale of Two Cities. Very familiar sentence. It was the best of times, it was the worst of times. And of course, whenever that book has been read since it was written a century and a half ago, people would be able to say, that's the time I'm in now. All times, I suppose, could be said to be the best of times and the worst of times. But some times are better than others, and other times are worse than others. And we, in the third millennium, are just emerging from the bloodiest century in the history of mankind, where millions and millions of innocent people were slaughtered in the name of ideologies, pagan ideologies, atheistic ideologies, mainly communism and Nazism. It's a dreadful, dreadful picture. And it may be that we're not out of that by a long shot yet, that we're in very difficult times. We see the continuing breakdown of the fabric of society. Things that just a short time ago in my lifetime were recognized by almost everyone as perversions have now become the law of the land in many places in the world. Abortion and euthanasia, homosexuality, all the agitation for homosexual marriages and so forth. This would have been unthinkable not very long ago. And of course, terrorism and the rise of Islam. None of us can regard that with equanimity. There is a threat here that has existed throughout the history of Europe and has flared up again and again, and it could very well flare up in a far worse way now, because in former time, the Islam was outside of Europe. Now Islam is, of course, scattered through Europe. So if war or violence should break out, it's not going to be easy to determine where the sides of it are. This is a very upsetting thing, and much of it, I would contend, I'm not going to develop this now, much of these modern evils, which, as I say, are historic, in the sense that you can't match them by appeal to any previous period of history. And it's been in the Orient, it's been in Europe, it's been in Asia, in Russia, and so forth. It's not been confined to one place. But wherever it has shown up, one can trace it to the abandonment of God, the abandonment of God. And for philosophers, we would take it back, I suppose, to the 17th and 18th century, when philosophers began to imagine a society in which men would be totally free because they would have been liberated from religious faith and from the governance of princes. Well, we have seen all around us the effects of this effort to build a society without God. Men trying to live together without acknowledging their origin, their creator, and their ultimate destiny. Now, many of the evils of modernity, could a philosopher might say, are due to the exaltation of reason. Huh? And since the remedy for the ills of modernity, as these courses will display, is Christianity, it might seem that there has to be an opposition between the Christian faith and reason. What I want to summarize in this kind of introductory lecture is the Church's position on that, as I say, relying on John Paul II's encyclical. He uses a metaphor at the beginning of that encyclical that man rises, the human spirit rises on two wings to God. And those two wings are faith on the one hand and reason on the other. The traditional teaching has been that these are complementary. They're not at war with one another. So the question then arises, why is it that the exaltation of reason, if I'm right, led to these historic disasters over the last century and more? Clearly, there has to be a way of understanding reason correctly in order for it to be compatible with the faith. What we're guided by in all this, and I'll develop this in the subsequent lecture, is the epistle of St. Paul to the Romans, in which Paul is speaking to the pagans as pagans, and he's reminding them of their misbehavior. And then he says, these deeds, and sometimes it looks like a menu of what's going on in our own society, these deeds, St. Paul says, are inexcusable. Yeah, we might think, well, look, he's talking with pagans. He wants them to become Christians, but they're not yet Christians, so why hold them so much at blame or at fault for doing these things? Don't pagans get a free ticket? And Paul is saying, no, they don't, that these deeds are inexcusable. Why? Because the human mind can, from the things that are made, come to knowledge of the invisible things of God. He's talking to pagans when he says that. And that's the opening that we have always seen taken or seized upon by the fathers of the church and by doctors and teachers through the Middle Ages down to our own time, John Paul II in his encyclical. The church celebrates the use of reason correctly understood, not as if it were something opposed, as if the use of reason necessarily led to the loss of faith and the denial of God. That was the claim of many figures in the Enlightenment. What our own tradition indicates to us is that there is no such necessary entailment at all. Now let's go into this thing in terms of the relationship between faith and reason. Let's go into it in terms of one of the difficulties that has been thrown at religious believers in quite recent times. You know, when Job says, I know that my Redeemer liveth, I know that my Redeemer liveth. Well, of course, believers often and easily refer to the things they believe, the truths they hold on the basis of faith, as things they know to be true. And yet at other times we find it important to distinguish between what it's like to know something and what it's like to believe something. Now, one of the criticisms that, as I say, in recent times has been leveled against Christian belief, it was stated in this maxim: it's immoral to give your assent to any proposition on insufficient evidence. That sounds reasonable. That sounds reasonable enough. But it has, as you'd agree, I think, the smack of the laboratory about it, as if every proposition is like a scientific hypothesis which must be tested and verified and finally admitted if it passes all these tests. And the suggestion seems to be, it's easy to show how practically ridiculous it would be, that every proposition I hold to be true, I have to rinse through this bath of verification and so forth. In answer to that, one way of kind of shaking things loose is to think of someone asking, if you know where you were born, and you say, of course I know where I was born. I was born in Minneapolis. You go up there and see the bronze plaque. No, I was born in Minneapolis. And he says, how do you know that? Well, my folks told me that. Your folks, huh? How do you know they're telling you the truth? And you think, I'll verify it. Huh? So you go up to Minneapolis, go to the courthouse, ask for the record. Baby boy McInerney, February 24th. I knew it. And your skeptical friend is saying, yeah, but who introduced that? Didn't your aunt used to work in the courthouse? I mean, so you can see the kind of skepticism that could be leveled at even so ordinary a remark as that, that you know where you were born and you know who your parents are. If that's not a scientific hypothesis that you verified. And it would perhaps turn out to be true that you really couldn't verify it in that fixed way. How do I know that Santiago, Chile is down there? Huh? Even if I've seen it, I'm not looking at it now. How do I know that it didn't blow away or it wasn't a mirage or something? How do I know that the next room that I can't see now is there? How do I know that I can take the word of others? Huh? You can see if you start getting skeptical about things like this and insist that it is immoral to give your assent to any proposition except on the basis of evidence of an overwhelming kind, 99% at least of what we say and act on would be immoral. It would be immoral to act on these propositions. Now, as Cardinal Newman suggested when he was confronted with this in the 19th century, it's not a matter of saying we're going to celebrate being unreasonable 99% of the time and confine reasonable to mean only those cases where we have something like scientific verification. No, what Newman suggests is, no, we're going to expand the notion of what reasonable means. Newman put it this way: it's unreasonable to expect that reasonable should always mean exactly the same thing. It's reasonable to take your parents' word for where you were born. It's reasonable to assume that Santiago, Chile is down there. You don't have to go take a look at it before you mail a letter to it. You wouldn't have to mail the letter. It's reasonable to do these things. Most of our lives are based on this kind of trust. St. Augustine said that human life would be impossible without our being able to rely on the word of one another. Sometimes we're deceived, of course. That's part of it. But we can't get around that. And so I'll say, I'll never again take anyone's word for anything that I haven't seen for myself. Now, there's a difference between, let's say, this kind of trust, human trust, our taking, say our Uncle Fulvio tells us that Santiago is down there, and we figure, he's never misled me before, I'll take his word for it. Well, you could go to Santiago yourself, of course, but would it be the same Santiago that your Uncle Fulvio talked about? Scientists, we could say, hold the bulk of what they hold to be true, even in their own small discipline. They hold this on the basis of trusting their colleague. You can imagine yourself talking with a microbiologist and he's saying, nowadays we know blah, 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 and a whole list of things that we now have achieved knowledge of in microbiology. We? And you ask him, did you run all these experiments? And he said, no. He points to all the journals on his shelf and says, the stuff is in there. That's why I know we know it. But you say, you don't know it. You're just taking the word of the editor or the author of the, well, what the scientists could say, well, I couldn't verify all of those findings, but I could verify any of them. I could verify any of them. So that is human trust of a kind that is merely an expedient. It can be replaced by knowledge. Other instances of human belief are permanent. Now, you just can't get around them. You love your wife, she loves you, you take her word, she takes yours. There's no way of getting around that. You will be faithful to her, that's a promise. It's not not just a prediction that something's going to happen you have nothing to do with. It's not a forecast of something that is inevitable. It's something you're going to bring about. That kind of sharing of trust is at the heart of most of our lives, and certainly at the heart of any kind of society. So there are truths that can be accepted on trust, and that trust can be replaced by knowledge. There are truths that are accepted on trust, and that's a fairly permanent thing. And then there are the truths of faith. The truths of faith, the belief in the Trinity of persons in one God, the belief in the incarnate God in Jesus, the belief in the resurrection of the dead. And so if you think of the creed and the articles of the creed, these are things that we believe, we hold to be true, we take God's word for it, and as long as we live, that's going to be the only way that we can firmly hold those propositions to be true. Well, that's a kind of menu of what I will be doing. Now, the structure of these little courses, as I should have pointed out earlier, is we first of all give these introductory talks, which are more or less of an overview, a forecast of what is in written lessons, which will be downloadable for those who want to take these courses from our website. International Catholic University. Those who follow the course, these are basic, they're easily followed, but they make demands, and you wouldn't be taking the time to take the course if it didn't make some demands on you. But they're user-friendly. I think you'll find that you can, whatever your background, you'll be able to catch hold of what we're trying to do in these particular courses. Now, the notion that the Church is interested and has been from the beginning in this relationship between what human beings can learn about themselves, about the world, and about God without any help from revelation. And on the one hand, and in what, of course, principally the Church is interested in what God has told us about himself. But the Church has always been interested in what human beings can come to know about themselves, the world, and God without the aid of revelation. And the reason for that, well, there are many reasons, but nowadays I've often been struck by this in reading John Paul II's encyclical Faith and Reason. You'd think when the Pope writes a letter, the main thing he's interested in, and maybe the only thing he'd be interested in, is defending the faith against skeptics or against criticisms made directly of the faith. And you can find church documents that look pretty much that way. But in more recent years, something has happened. It's not only the case that we find the faith defended in these ecclesiastical documents, but reason as well. Reason as well. I started with difficulties that believers sometimes face from people who seem to have a great deal of trust in reason. That goes back a ways. That example that I use, that it's immoral to accept any proposition except on the basis of overwhelming evidence, that goes back maybe 50 years or so. Nowadays, one of the troubling features of philosophy, my discipline, is that we have a lot of people who have lost faith in the ability of reason to know the world, to know anything for sure about the world. There are many versions of this, but it's a kind of massive skepticism that permeates the theory of knowledge of many people, that anything I say about the world is really a projection from my mind onto who knows what. But I'm not seeing what's really there, I'm interpreting it. And that's all we really do. And how our interpretations then, which conflict, can be put together is an interesting question. But imagine that there are people who draw a salary for teaching philosophy and are fairly prestige, have a lot of prestige in the field, and they are in effect saying the human mind is incapable of achieving truth. Well, the Church can't sit still for that. And one reason is, as we'll be developing in the next half hour, one reason for that is that the faith isn't derived from what we can know by reason alone, but it depends on it in ways that I'll want to develop. If it were really the case that we can't know anything about the world, just to bring it into focus, how could we understand, say, the parables of Jesus? I mean, he's talking about things in the world and ordinary events, familiar events, as if everyone who is listening to him understands and knows those things. And then on the basis of that knowledge, with grace, they can go beyond that understanding, say, of the parable of the prodigal son, and they see, that is the relation of God to his creatures. That's the point of the parable. But Christ couldn't teach in that way, and we're told that that's the only way he did teach, except to his inner circle. He couldn't do that unless it was possible for the human mind to know the world and themselves and to use that as a springboard for the further truths that Jesus wanted to reveal to them. It's not, of course, surprising that the church would be defending reason as well as faith, because it's an indirect way of defending faith itself, as I suggest with that example of the parables. But if we go into our understanding of what a human being is, the nature of man as compared to anything else in this cosmos of ours, man alone is made in the image of his Creator. Meaning what? That he has a mind and a will. He's made to know and love God. That's the point of human existence. And that's why it's such a tragedy when reason is abused and used against itself and against that end, against that aim. And that is something that, of course, the church would be interested in, if only on its own terms. But of course, it has its impact on how we understand those truths that we accept on the authority of God revealing, and which throughout this life we will accept only on the basis of that trust in God. Kierkegaard, the great Lutheran theologian, put it this way, that the only difference between the simple man and the wise man with respect to the truths of Christianity is that the simple man doesn't understand them, and the wise man understands that he doesn't understand them. So it's a kind of Socratic ignorance, you might say. There's a lot more that has to be said and that we will be pointing to in the next half hour and in the lessons that accompany these introductory things. What I would want to stress is the non-hostility of the faith towards reason or vice versa. Those two wings that John Paul II talked about are meant to be complementary and permit a balanced ascension, a balanced flight. So we're talking about things which are not in one sense central to the Christian message, but in another sense are extremely important for it. This is one reason why people like myself have spent a long lifetime teaching philosophy in a Catholic university. The role of philosophy, the role of this pursuit and examination of what we can know for sure using our mind or with degrees of certainty, this is a very important complement to those who in my university teach theology. And we'll be saying something in the next half hour and certainly in the lessons that accompany this introductory lecture, these introductory lectures. We'll be saying a lot more about what we understand by, on the one hand, philosophy and on the other hand, theology. So, faith and reason. We're going to look at the text of St. Paul a little more closely and the implications of that text and what has been made of it by the great doctors of the Christian faith over the centuries, and try to express what they have had to say in terms that will be relevant for the situation in which we find ourselves. What we want to avoid at all costs is the idea that the faith is some kind of vacation from reason or being reasonable. But it's reasonable in a very different way. Think of Cardinal Newman again. Believing is reasonable. Divine faith is reasonable in a way very different, of course, from the way in which being a microbiologist is being reasonable, or trusting your wife is being reasonable. It's very different from those kinds of reasonableness, and that was Newman's point. We don't want to try to pin that term down to one only use. We're not inventing these other uses, of course. We're just noticing how they too occur in ordinary language of human beings. We want to pull those out and examine them. And sometimes the use that has been obscured and almost forgotten is the use that is most important most of the time, and which guarantees that even people like ourselves can lead a reasonable life, but more importantly, that we have this conviction that our belief in God, our belief in the truths that have been revealed, is a reasonable act. Well, that's about what I wanted to do in this first half hour. Introduce the topic of faith and reason, make special reference to the encyclical of that title. If you take this course from the website, that's one of the texts that you'll be wanting to read, but of course you don't have to take the course in order to read that papal encyclical. In the written material, I tell you how you can find the materials that I refer to on the web and download them at no cost. So that's our preliminary presentation of the topic of faith and reason, and next time I'll be going on to something a little bit more tied down to the scriptural passage in the Epistle to the Romans that I've already mentioned.